So this is the final video lecture for Unit 6, dealing with World War II and kind of post-war era, Cold War, 1950s, civil rights, affluence, all sorts of things. The first chapter, 27, deals with the United States entering World War II, which we enter after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. We'd had some concerns. The war World War II had begun in 1939, and there were other issues going on in Asia, and we had tension with Japan throughout much of the 1930s. But we finally get involved in 1941 with the war, in the broader sense, had been going on elsewhere for quite some time. So the United States was lucky in many ways because there was no, except for Pearl Harbor, no real damage done to the nation internally in terms of industry or structures or cities, and something that Europe and Asia did suffer quite a bit from. The war it also helps bring the United States out of the Depression. We have a lot of federal monies going into wartime industries to help bring us up to speed for the war effort, which brings a lot of as men are going off to war. This also leaves a kind of a bit of a vacancy in wartime jobs, and women and other minorities take up these jobs. So this is the idea of Rosie the Riveter, women taking factory jobs, and even minorities taking on jobs that they wouldn't have been necessarily had before, supervisory jobs, usually over people of the same sort of ethnic group as them, but somewhat of a step up. A lot of these jobs that they do get during World War II vanish after the war, but at least for some extent during World War II there's some opportunity for these groups, women and minorities in particular. The war, the last several years will be over in 1945. There's the victory in Japan, which is victory in Europe was in Germany, which is on May 8th, and then victory in Japan in August of 1945. And during the war, we're focused on a lot of building industry and factories and structures, and we ration goods. So we have goods for soldiers. There's selling of war bonds and war stamps. Ideas to have people give an idea that they are contributing in some way. There is the sort of infamous part of the war, Executive Order 9066, which Roosevelt issues in February of 1942. Just it's worded in a bit complicated sort of way, but essentially what it allows the U.S. to do is to intern Japanese and Japanese Americans. Most of them were citizens, and there's about 120,000 Japanese on the West Coast primarily. Most of these are interned in camps throughout the West. There's 2 internment camps in California, one in Manzanar, which is in Owens Valley, and one Tule Lake, which is up on the Modoc Plateau in the northeastern corner of California. Were out-of-the-way places. Disrupted a lot of their communities. There's a community of Japanese Americans down on Terminal Island and Little Tokyo in downtown LA, and Japanese farmers in the Imperial Valley. So this was a bit disruptive, obviously, and in some cities problematic. There are 2 court cases that happened during the war that essentially affirmed the U.S.'s right to do this. Hirabayashi and Korematsu in the late or mid-1940s. Well, the war goes on, and the United States and other nations are suffering. There's tremendous losses during the war, civilians and soldiers, casualties estimated upwards 70, 80 million. United States doesn't lose that many, several 100,000, but throughout the world there's a lot of grief, suffering, death. The war in Europe will end as the United States and its allies, Great Britain, Soviet Union here in particular, there's France also, end up finally defeating Germany in May. And the United States is also making progress against Japan. There's a fear that we'll have to invade Japan, but we've been working on a project to build nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs, and we succeed in this, and we test them in July of 1945, and they're ready. So Truman decides to use them essentially to save lives. Argues American lives principally, but also Japanese lives too, because it's feared that the invasion of Japan would cost too many lives. So we dropped 2 atomic bombs, August 6th and August 9th, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, initially each of them killing, 30, 40,000 plus people, and the after effects from radiation and other injuries will top that also. There'll be over 100,000 in each city that will die either directly or shortly afterwards from these bombings. So that ends the war. After the war, the United States is left in quite a good position economically, militarily. We weren't directly attacked, and we created a strong military. We've positioned ourselves to have a lot of say in the post-war world. We were there in helping to create the United Nations, which is an institution that comes about after the League of Nations, which came after World War One. Helped set up Bretton Woods and other, the World Bank and things like this, make the dollar essentially the currency of the world. So after the war, initially there's, a lot of tension about how essentially to divide up or to what extent nations will be able to allow to choose their own leaders and be sovereign. This is a big issue in Europe. This is where a lot of tension rises between the United States and the Soviet Union. And shortly after the war, and we're talking years here, tension rises between the United States and the Soviet Union, and eventually leads to 1947, the Truman Doctrine, which is Harry S. Truman is our president at the time, and this doctrine is the idea that the states, the world is divided into 2 worlds. There's the free, and then there's the unfree. Essentially, the first world, the free world; the second world, the unfree world, is the communist world, and then the third. It doesn't define the third world, but the third world is everybody not aligned with those 2. And that we need to, in some ways, stop or contain. This is the idea of contain communism, to not let it expand. We can do this in many ways. We could do it by spending money, like through the Marshall Plan that will come later, to help rebuild industry and infrastructure in Europe, or in agriculture in Europe and elsewhere, and militarily, to contain any sort of advancement of what we see as communist ideas or gains. This comes to a big head in 1950 on June 25th, when North Korea invades South Korea. Many in the United States, not necessarily politicians, but many Americans see this in the beginning as World War III. The United States will essentially use the UN and as a police action, and with South Korea, push back the North Koreans, and we pushed too far, and the Chinese pushed back, and eventually end up back to the 38th parallel 3 years later, from 1950 to 1953. But this is a big event. We think the North Koreans are working under the guise of Soviet Union. They are not directly, they have contact, but we see all communist nations kind of aligned. And so in many ways, the Korean War, the Korean conflict of 1950, 1953 is in some ways a real marker of the Cold War, this war that is pitched between the United States and the Soviet Union, battling over world power, part ideology, and influence throughout the world, politically, economically, ideologically. And the Cold War, kind of hits home in the United States. We see this as there's a big rise in fear of communism in the United States. This is seen through what's called the Red Scare. It's really the second Red Scare. You had Red Scare after World War I, you had a Red Scare after World War II, so Red Scare number 2, and really kind of moves forward through Senator Joseph McCarthy, who claims to see Soviet spies and American communists everywhere. They're infiltrating our society. They're in our government. We create loyalty oaths at this time. There's the Karen Security Act, Internal Security Act, which makes a communist register with the federal government. We changed the Pledge of Allegiance, and 1954, we add the words under God. We put under God on our bills. These are added to the idea that America is under God and that, the Soviets are atheists, that we're positioning ourselves in a sense ideologically as being different from them. It creates a lot of fear. We have the bomb, and in 1949, the Soviet Union also tested and successfully tested their first atomic bomb. So now we both have atomic bombs. So in some ways, there's some real fear, some real threat here, but there's also a larger sort of perceived threat about that their lives are changing and that the communists are going to invade us either physically or kind of ideologically, changing our ideas and what we think about freedom. So this is all happening in the post-World War era and the rise of the Cold War, which, you can date this at several points and lasting through sort of 91 or so is usually the typical date given for the end of the Cold War. But there's other things going on in the United States after the war too. We come out of this economically fairly successful, and there is a little recession after the war in 45, 46. It's not as if everything is economically booming immediately, but shortly thereafter, a few years, the economy is going, and we see several things happen in the late 40s and through the 50s. Economy grows, unemployment drops, consumer prices drop in many ways, in terms of food, in terms of just basic necessities. In terms of housing, this is the rise of tract homes, massive tract homes. Building 10,000 homes at a time and selling them cheaply, with the help of the federal government through programs that were started during the Great Depression. Didn't really mention, but the HOLC and the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, help people afford homes, and so you're building lots of homes. So you're and you're building them small. These early homes in the late 40s are 800-900 square feet, and you're building so many that you're driving down the costs, and people have jobs, and so people are able to afford these new large tract homes. Sometimes they're called ticky-tack houses, because the first sort of tract home is the Levittown on Log Island, and it he has 6 homes, and he builds them over and over and over thousands of times, but he has 12 because he makes mirror images of those 6, but they all look the same. This is the idea of kind of the sameness, this uniformity. But it also made things affordable for people. You could have your own home. The single family home ownership really rises, goes from like 30% up to like 60% by 1970. And a lot of people are living suburban, so more people moving out of the city. Before we talked about people moving to the city, now people are moving out of the city to suburban areas. And moving to suburban areas, there was a number of issues there. There was a lot of restrictions on who could buy homes, particularly in the late 40s and early 50s. And you could have segregation policies, redlining policies. You could have language in a housing contract that forbade one to sell it to someone other than a white person. So you have lots of people who are unable to move to these suburban areas because of various either legal or social or institutional frameworks that make it difficult or impossible for someone to buy homes in these new neighborhoods that are this new suburbs that have new amenities, new streets, new schools, new plumbing, new all these things. And so you see a bit of decay in the cities. This is the deindustrialization of the cities, and there's not a lot of as much going on there. Things are moving outside the cities, and this is facilitated by a lot of money going into infrastructure, whether it's schools. The CSUB itself is created in this period in the late 40s, early 50s, called the 49ers. And also roads. We're building highways. In 1956, the federal government allocates, through the Highway and Defense Act, $26 billion to build interstates. Some states, California and others, have started building what we call freeways. At the time were called parkways, to facilitate travel. kind of like trains did, but here you could move even further to suburbs. You could drive to work, you could drive to your home, you could drive to go shopping. That's how a lot of neighborhoods were developed. They weren't integrated. There was housing in one place, there was work in another, there was shopping in another. And a lot of the new jobs, particularly that are driven by the Cold War, which a lot of them are defense jobs, are out in the suburbs too. So everything's kind of moving away from the city out to the suburbs. And if there's restrictions on who could buy those homes, then you can see a problem with potential ability to have the capacity to make an earning that might even allow you to buy a suburban home if you were allowed to legally, or redlining practices weren't in place. And these highways, if you look at Southern California, there's a lot of freeways, and these are fantastic at times because they allow us to travel faster and quicker, as long as it's not rush hour, it's not too much traffic. But they also meant they had to go through neighborhoods, and a lot of neighborhoods were already established, and you have to plow through neighborhoods. If you look at some freeways, the houses are right next to them. I mean, these are massive entities, these freeways. They're originally 3 lanes on each side, then there are 4 lanes on each side, and these are quite wide, and you have to have all those houses for miles taken out. So this could be difficult and harder on some neighborhoods, cutting them off, cutting neighborhoods off. Where do people go in certain neighborhoods if their house has been bought under eminent domain? Probably not able to move to the suburbs. So this is another issue with housing. What happens to them? This is in the middle of sort of the civil rights growth and movement of the 1950s, which is highlighted by well-known case Brown versus Board of Education, which is about school segregation. California at this point didn't have segregation. Through a court case in 1948, Mendez versus Westminster, which is actually about a Mexican-American family in Westminster, which is close to CSULB, a petition to have their children not be in segregated schools, not segregate Mexican Americans. And the California Supreme Court in 1948 got rid of that. But at the national level, this doesn't happen until the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954-55, which says you can no longer segregate, but that doesn't mean desegregation happens immediately. You already had, you can think about this in 2 ways. In one way, neighborhoods were already segregated due to housing policies. And so if you desegregate them, that doesn't mean the people living in those areas are going to be going to different schools, or schools around them are the same as they were before. And secondly, many areas did many things to make it difficult to desegregate. Some schools just shut down for the year. Some made it very difficult for ethnic minorities to attend schools. And so it's a very slow process. So you think of Brown, it legally and technically ends segregation, but it does not in any shape or form immediately change what is in terms of either de facto segregation or just getting states and local municipalities to move towards desegregating schools. I think I covered just about everything. On top of this, I said I'd make this shorter, and it never happens, is the baby booming's happening. There's more children because of these houses. The television has arrived into homes. I think in 1946, there's under 10,000 television sets, and then, by 1950, there's over 1 million. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but something like that. There's a huge growth during this time. So TV becomes a staple in the 1950s, and the TV shows kind of represent this, and the advertising you can see this through the advertising. So there's different sort of forms of technology that are influencing people's lives in the 50s and into the 60s. We'll leave it at that. If you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck on your final historical thinking. Thanks.